Just a quick note before your podcast today that Sierra Club Canada and the Environment in Canada podcast are currently running a communications survey. This is to get your views and your thoughts on our communications, both for the Environment in Canada podcast and also for Sierra Club Canada generally. We don't know if what we're doing works, so let us know. You'll find a link to that survey in the description of today's podcast. These people may be in rural areas too, where it's harder sometimes to join groups in person that share the values of environmental and social justice, and where Facebook is pretty key to communications within that rural community. Being online can also be an issue of accessibility. Not everyone can participate in on-the-ground protests. Some people really value, as a result, the ability to make a difference by using social media, and this is a key reason why in any situation we still need digital alternatives to billionaire platforms. But this is also a key reason to make sure we are truly shifting people over to safer, less hateful online spaces, not just leaving them behind. Yes, it's important to connect with the community around you in combating oligarchy and environmental destruction. But it's also important to link communities engaged in that struggle with each other nationally and internationally. Just look at the climate denialists themselves. They might be voices locally in their communities, but on social media, they're often also connected to climate denialists in other countries like the US. This is where the value of at least some people staying on platforms like Meta continues to exist. It is in disrupting the echo chamber the owners want to create, finding the sympathetic people or the people on the fence and bringing them elsewhere. Ironically, climate denialists are great at this and we can learn from their tactics. Welcome to another special episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, part of our new sub-series we will be running on some Saturdays. We're calling this new sub-series Sovereignty Saturdays, and the common theme to these episodes will be a focus on countering attempts by the US government to annex Canada with an environmental lens. If you haven't gotten a chance yet, please go back and check out the first 3 episodes of Sovereignty Saturdays. But these episodes are going to be about more than just that. Because to protect Canada's sovereignty, and with it the communities and environments we know and love, we need to understand why it's under threat. Around the world, democracy is under attack, and far from secondary, environmental and energy issues are core to understanding why that's happening. The erosion of rights and democracy anywhere harms us all, and hurts our ability to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and to make the changes we need to make to have a safe, renewable future. Wealthy polluters have identified their main obstacle to continuing to profit from pollution. And that obstacle is democracy. In this money versus the money moment, we need to come together to say loudly and clearly that we won't let them take democracy away from us. More to the point, we need new visions for stronger democratic systems that can help defend what we love. I'm your host, Connor Curtis, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada. Today's episode is all about whether to leave tech billionaire influenced social media platforms like X or Facebook, or to stay. Or more importantly, how to leave or how to stay, drawing insight from the strategies and tactics of the very climate denialists and anti-democratic actors who make those places so toxic to begin with. So there's been a lot of talk about whether or not, as those concerned about the climate and social and environmental issues, to leave platforms like X or Meta, Facebook/Instagram, or other networks, given their ties to the US administration, ties to multi-billionaires, general allowance of hateful messaging, or direct encouragement of hateful messaging, not to mention the lack of any real efforts to counter misinformation on these platforms, or their actual removal of efforts to counter disinformation that they had before. That's also not to mention the presence of a lot of pro-annexationist content and democratic authoritarian content, and increasingly the integration of dubious AI systems and ongoing armies of bots that exist on these platforms. These social media platforms, controlled largely by US oligarchs, do pose a threat to our sovereignty here in Canada, too. And so today we are going to look not at a single set measure to deal with them, but at a series of tactics you might use to combat the influence of oligarchs and bad actors on those platforms and the overall influence of the platforms themselves. I'd also like to stress here that the Canadian government should be stepping in to do more about this problem and about disinformation generally. This should not be on the shoulders of the Canadian people, but sadly, one of the few tactics that actually works to prevent authoritarian movements or oligarchs from taking over countries is when people themselves peacefully resist. Governments should act, but commonly don't because they're being actively lobbied by business interests like big tech companies. We'll be getting into that more in a future episode, but for today's episode, I want to focus on individual and community action online, because that is something that we can all individually and as a community control. Right off the top of this episode, I am going to say that as far as boycotting X or Meta or any other platform, I am not going to tell you what to do. What I am going to do is leave you with some options and considerations for how to assess staying versus leaving a particular platform, what to do if you want to stay or to leave. Because I think those oligarchs want those who love democracy to leave their social media platforms, and I think either staying or going can be strategic depending upon how you go about it. I also want to suggest thinking of boycotts of social media platforms not only as an immediate action with a defined result that's going to happen tomorrow or next week. Some boycotts work right away and others take time, but instead as a process of slowly trickling away users. That's why I'm going to encourage you, if you stay on a billionaire-owned or influenced social media platform, to change the way you use it so as to be strategic rather than passive. In fact, later we're going to go over how climate denialists have taken over these platforms and how you can use their tactics too, because there's more to what they did to turn places like X, as toxic as they are, than simply Elon Musk taking over ownership and manipulating things behind the scenes. Also, right off the top, I'm going to say I can 100% understand someone leaving X, for instance, especially if you are likely to be a target on the platform for hate. Never put yourself in harm's way, and that's rule number one in all of this. Here I'm only going to be talking about boycotts and engagement on these platforms as abstract tactics, but again, take everything I am saying with a massively important context that some people are at more risk online than others. In the last episode of our Sovereignty Saturdays sub-series entitled Winning the Communications War of the US Oligarchy and Big Oil and Gas Requires You, we talked about having multiple tactics as a tool belt, not seeing tactics themselves as a philosophy or strategy. We also broke down the difference between tactics, specific actions, versus strategy, which is your path more generally to making change towards objectives. Boycotts are a tactic, sometimes a core tactic to a strategy, and sometimes a secondary one, but boycotts alone are not a strategy to deal with a problem. The problem is that we have billionaires who are in charge of huge amounts of social media and other media forms as well, by the way, who are either using their platforms to spread disinformation, climate denial, and anti-democratic sentiments and hate, or are simply letting it happen. Thus, they are creating these echo chambers of that hate and disinformation. The objective is to develop and grow social media alternatives to billionaire social media channels, or to use methods of communication they don't control as much, like in-person events, or phone calls, or email lists, or even old-fashioned mail. The point being to build and maintain communities of people who care about truth, democracy, and the environment, and can access and share truthful and justice-focused content consistently, regularly, and quickly. Ultimately, it's looking at a structure that allows us to organize together for change and to protect the environment, sovereignty, and democracy, and building a communication structure to that end. The strategy is to draw people to those other channels, develop those channels, and build community. The tactics might include boycotting billionaire social media, but, and here's the but, it can also mean disrupting those platforms in ways to get people to question what they're seeing on them, and hopefully, at least, also to join a more truthful platform or to get involved in environmental democratic justice movement more generally, maybe in person. First of all, understand that while a boycott of a social media platform like X can help harm the platform's reputation or legitimacy, it's unlikely to harm its economics in a way that will actually shut it down. Because even if the platform goes into economic turmoil, billionaires and oligarchs will simply fund a platform with other funds to keep it running so long as it has a communications benefit to them. That's not saying that boycotts are pointless, but it's saying it's good to have a realistic idea of what a boycott will achieve. And the other end of that, building the other channels, the alternatives. Don't set an expectation that a boycott alone is the end of a story. There are also ways of doing a boycott that are more and less effective. For instance, if a bunch of high-profile people with legitimacy leave a platform, that has more of an impact on a platform's reputation than a bunch of people leaving who are not as famous. If the point is to get people off the platform, and you're not a famous person, then a single tweet announcing your departure and where to find you elsewhere may not have as much impact as continuing to stay on the platform occasionally, but asking people to come join you in another space, digitally or event-wise. This is unless there is a true mass departure taking place, in which case, yes, join the mass departure, right? Send a message that way. Even if you are famous, it may make sense to leave your profile up, but just stop using the platform that you want to leave, and leave notes everywhere on your profile before you stop using it, stating where to find your content elsewhere. Leave a ghost town of abandoned profiles with signs that say, go this way for something better, and a lot of people actually have already done this. For example, let's say you're a famous singer and people on X are likely to try to follow you as an account. If they instead find an abandoned account under your name with a link to a Blue Sky account or some other social media channel, maybe they'll bother to open another account, since all the famous people they want to follow are now on Blue Sky or some other network that's kind of similar to X. But I'm not famous, so the rest of this podcast is for the rest of us. Here's the other thing to keep in mind. Because a community of caring, truth-seeking, justice-concerned people does leave a platform, does not stop people not already connected to that community from joining the platform that you left. There are lots of people on Meta, for instance, who are on the fence about a lot of issues, who do not know there are alternative places to be with more truthful information. These people may be in rural areas too, where it's harder sometimes to join groups in person that share the values of environmental and social justice, and where Facebook is pretty key to communications within that rural community. They may be a part of that buy and sell Facebook group in their community, or the community gatherings group, so they're unlikely to give up a Facebook account. Being online can also be an issue of accessibility. Not everyone can participate in on-the-ground protests. Some people really value, as a result, the ability to make a difference by using social media, and this is a key reason why in any situation we still need digital alternatives to billionaire platforms. But this is also a key reason to make sure we are truly shifting people over to safer, less hateful online spaces, not just leaving them behind. Another key point. Yes, it's important to get off social media. Yes, it's important to connect with the community around you in combating oligarchy and environmental destruction. But it's also important to link communities engaged in that struggle with each other nationally and internationally. And social media, at least for making initial connections, is still a good place to meet those other communities in other places, even if you later move that conversation somewhere else. Just look at the climate denialists themselves. They might be voices locally in their communities, but on social media, they're often also connected to climate denialists in other countries like the US. Because I would argue one of the reasons tech billionaires are making such hateful and offensive statements is in part to try and turn their platforms into solid echo chambers where dissenting voices have left completely. Tech oligarchs and the US administration got scared earlier this year because AIs, artificial intelligence, they felt were creating content that was too woke, quote unquote. They have spent a lot of time since trying to prevent AIs from accidentally promoting anything other than their oligarchical worldview, and it's kind of easy to understand why they would be concerned about this. AIs were previously being trained on everything and anything, so what they produced was likely to be a weird mix of good and bad arguments, truth and lies, because that's what humanity's conversation looks like, a mixture of mostly good but increasingly bad and some horrible arguments. AIs might have drifted a bit woke, quote unquote, before billionaires started trying to filter their content, because humanity in general tends to drift more and more towards social and environmental justice over time without billionaire influence to stop that drift. In fact, one tactical use of AI that you could potentially consider, granted it comes with an environmental impact that you also have to consider, is actually uploading a bunch of environmental and social justice content into different AIs in order to give it something else to read than what the billionaires want it to be fed on. But this may or may not have a long-term effect. It might have an effect now where they're not as good for screening for that stuff, but it might not have as good an effect later. It's still something interesting worth considering. But more importantly, this gives away a weakness in tech billionaire and oligarchs' armor. They're afraid of cracks showing in their messaging. They're afraid of people leaking away from their orbit, not only in massive numbers, but at a moderate rate too. Because as hard as it is to see sometimes, the truth still is, and always will be, the high ground of communications. The truth has its own momentum. And the reality is that billionaires have to spend huge amounts of money to distract people from the truth. That covering up of the truth is not sustainable as the world starts to collapse around all of us due to billionaire impacts. As Martin Luther King Jr. put it, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. AI was supposed to make it easier for tech billionaires to obscure the truth, and it's going to have a big impact. I'm not understating its catastrophic impact for our media ecosystem, but every single new person who develops connections in a life beyond the social media platforms billionaires control represents a huge blow to their power. Every person who knows how to critically assess what they are seeing online is a huge win. Every person, you get to at least go to a better platform as well, or maybe even join your email list, or even better, to be able to talk to and meet with at a protest. Every person who is not already in your network, who comes into that network, has a big impact because they can in turn talk to their friends and so on. The truth will always ultimately win out over time. You need only hasten the truth's victory as much as possible. And so, whether you choose to boycott platforms like X or Meta, make sure you are still expanding your orbit constantly wherever you communicate. Maybe that's in person, maybe that's online. I'll link to a previous podcast episode below, which talks about how to use metaphor and conversation to connect with people outside of your circle, whether in person or online. But remember, the key here is not to waste time talking to people who will never agree with you, nor to waste time talking with only those people who already agree with you all the time, although that can be helpful from the perspective of solidarity and a feeling of support sometimes. Instead, your goal should be to find those people who are on the fence and bring them into your network. But let's say you decide to stay on a platform like Meta or X. If you continue to do so, let's think about doing so strategically, because that's going to look a lot different to staying there and doing what you normally do or did in the past. The trick is to use the platform in a non-standard way, to hack the way the platform works rather than being a passive user. Ironically, climate denialists are great at this, and we can learn from their tactics. You've probably heard the term being red-pilled, the reference to the original Matrix movie that I grew up with. Being red-pilled is a term which is used by hate groups and climate denialists to refer to bringing someone over to their side. It's actually a pretty good metaphor for bringing people over to a position in the digital age, though. If you haven't seen the original Matrix, and if you're wondering how old I am for even bringing it up, basically the plotline that matters is that the movie is set in a future where humanity is trapped in a machine-generated digital world. Some free people in the real world hack into the fake world that's machine-controlled to cause trouble or to occasionally liberate someone they feel might be willing to hear the truth. Climate denialists and hate groups basically took this fictional concept and applied it to social media. They entered the digital world in which we consume information and look around for people they could radicalize. They start fights online with others strategically, not to convince the person they're fighting with, but to convince the people around that person witnessing the fight, or to draw the people around them into their orbit. They look for people who seem to be sympathetic to their philosophy, but are alone, and they try to unite them with others. Some climate denialists know this is a scam, but some probably actually see themselves as like Neo or Morpheus characters from the Matrix, liberating people from the fake, quote-unquote, woke, quote-unquote, digital reality of yesterday's social media landscape. Well, today a lot of social media platforms literally are kind of like the Matrix in that they are places of control, in this case for oligarchical interests. So if you're going to stay on Meta or X or any other platform owned by a billionaire, I suggest you adopt similar tactics to those of the climate denialists. Rather than using the platform to passively share content, misuse it to get more people off the platform. Locate those people who are on the fence, search out people who are being bullied by climate denialists, and offer them spaces outside the billionaire platform to connect with like-minded people. Maybe some of them will even end up going out and searching out for others in turn. You might just keep posting content and liking others' content, as you always have, but in so doing, be on the lookout for who's liking what sort of content and try to get people to join other platforms or actually attend events if they seem sympathetic. The difference in this case is not so much in what you're doing, but in your messaging. You want to be including notes that it's best to be on a different platform or a different form of communication. Here's another strategy. Maybe you post recipe blogs to Facebook, but your mailing list for the recipes that people sign up for as a result also nods to social justice and environmental justice content as well. Most recipe blogs start with a long personal story anyways, so why not one roughly on the themes of environmental and social justice or incorporating them subversively? If you do plan to start conversations online with people you disagree with, say things like, if you want the real truth, join me on alternative platform of your choice here. All of the content on this platform is fake. Or say things like, I heard differently on link to other platform. Again, it's not to convince the person you are arguing against, it's to lead those watching the argument somewhere else. This is a situation where I'd really suggest anonymity, though. You also shouldn't be mean or demeaning or threatening to anyone in anything that you do. You don't need to be. You don't need to lie about anything either. Just ask questions or state something is fake and lead people elsewhere. The people who don't go are probably never going to go. The people who react negatively are probably never going to listen to you. But there are people out there who might, and you should try to get them over to your side. The big lesson here is, again, hack into the matrix, not to be a part of it, but to get people out of it and to cause doubt and trouble that draws attention to the fact that there's something wrong with the platform and that it's just an echo chamber for the propaganda of the ultra rich. Again, it's important to know who to connect with. And weirdly here, the Matrix is again a good pop cultural analogy to use. The climate denialists really picked a great metaphor here. In the movie, in the digital world of the Matrix, there are machine agents that can pose as real people, just as bots pose as people on social media. There are even people in the Matrix who hide their intentions to undermine the quote unquote good guys' efforts. So, a few caveats to what I am saying here. First, make sure you're mentally ready for wading through hateful disinformation if you're going to stay on a place that's toxic, because you're going to have to wade through a lot of it and you're going to have to ignore all of it to find the people you need to find who can be brought over. There are lots of ways to help in terms of communications, like setting up in-person events or just going to places in the real world and talking to other people, expanding your network that way. This digital stuff isn't easy, and you shouldn't feel bad about hiding your identity if you're on a billionaire-owned platform. I'd even advise it, as well as other digital security precautions. Secondly, again, I cannot stress this enough. If you're measuring success by, I managed to convince a climate denier not to be a climate denier, then you will have little success. Likewise, if you're measuring success by, I talk to the same people I always talk to and they all agreed on the same thing, you will also likewise have little success. The key is to find people really on the fence. Thirdly, get good at spotting bots, but keep in mind that a lot of accounts online are bots because that actually makes this kind of thing easier to do. If you're going to take on wading through the hate and disinformation, it's easier to realize a good amount of it is literally just code. No one's home. Really recommend going back to our previous episode on why countering the US oligarchy and big oil and gas requires you, because we get into understanding why social media engagement is just not a good way to measure public opinion in any sense, partially because of bots, partially because the people who interact with social media are likely to hold strong views anyway, and why public polling is really important to look at instead, but also even with public polling, how to read between the lines on it rather than just trust whatever you're seeing. Fourthly, if you're going to do the discussion tactic and have discussions with people you disagree with just so other people see there is a discussion happening and maybe get drawn somewhere better, don't try to stand for anything in particular. Just ask questions, annoying questions. Ask them politely, in fact. And again, focus on getting people to another decent platform rather than trying to keep them there on that one. Never wear your heart on your sleeve. Again, you shouldn't be mean or demeaning or threatening in anything that you do. It's just not necessary. Just be annoying by pointing out the inconsistencies or asking questions that will puzzle someone. Learn to enjoy being annoying in that sense, without needing to declare anything of your own thoughts or the things that you in fact care about. See who reacts positively to what you're saying. See who might be the right people to bring over to a different platform of communication. You might get a barrage of negative comments and reactions. The climate denialists, etc., will want you to go away and to feel crushed. You're looking for the few positive reactions in what you've said. Those are the people who might be worth reaching out to. It's a bit like panning for gold. It takes patience. Don't be afraid to just block accounts that are clearly trolls or bots too. You can just block people if it's really clear that they're bad faith actors. All of these tactics are a big part of how climate denialists and hate groups have brought people over to their causes over time online. The only difference between them and you is, unlike them, you really are fighting a rigged digital system controlled by extremely wealthy, powerful individuals, and you really are trying to liberate people from its framing of reality. Finally, never give the billionaire platform more than you need to. Think about it in terms of net benefit. Yes, by being on a platform just to begin with, you're lending it some support by increasing its reach. But if you get 5 people off the platform or get them doing the same thing as you, you're still doing something that's a net benefit to the cause of environmental and social justice and democracy. It's also not worth engaging on that platform if you're totally worn out afterwards. Engage, if you do, only to the extent that's sustainable and strategic. There's plenty to do in the real world that requires we stay upbeat and energetic. Make sure you take time to genuinely connect with other people who are supportive. And again, strategically, think think about it in terms of net benefit. Take a step back, look at the bigger picture, nurture positive networks and other platforms too, because those need to grow. There's a whole nother aspect there that you've got to balance. Go for a walk and be able to walk down the street with a defiant smirk after being online. Remember to reward other platforms that you see as being ethical, or at least good enough, by contributing to the community on them. And it's not about not boycotting these platforms. It's about boycotting them strategically if you can't defeat them with the initial boycott alone. One other quick point, if you are setting up alternative channels and networks for communications, I recommend setting up redundancies because you never know what's going to be reliable in the future. And having those non-digital backups also, as much as you can, is really, really important. The last general point I'm going to make here about strategy, and we talked about this in the previous Sovereignty Saturdays episode linked below, is when we're talking about strategy, it's not sometimes about having the perfect strategy or knowing exactly what to do in the moment. And sometimes in social and environmental justice circles, we get caught up in this discussion of what is the exact perfect action to do in this moment. And sometimes there is the right action and the wrong action to do, but actually what's more helpful sometimes when we're confronting oligarchy is literally just to kind of experiment and see what can we do to mess with oligarchy? What can we do to undermine it? What can we do to cause trouble? Enjoy the humor of messing with its systems, enjoy the humor of disrupting what oligarchs want to do. That can sometimes be just as valuable as having these set strategies or these set tactics that have to work every single time or that we think of as right or wrong. Sometimes it's about multiple strategies coming to the same conclusion, and that requires some experimentation, that requires seeing what works and what doesn't, and sharing that with other people who are working towards the same goal. Again, that's an aspect of full spectrum resistance you might want to check out that we mentioned in that previous episode. But the wider sort of philosophical implication of this is, and again, I'm going to look at climate denialists here, who, a lot of whom online do what they do, literally for the laughs, right? And I think sometimes we get too caught up in sort of our circles of thinking of things in terms of optimism or pessimism. A much stronger philosophy is kind of ethical absurdism. The world is an absurd place. It's full of absurd things. We're sometimes reliant upon the very systems that we want to change, whether that's social media platforms or oil and gas. And the sort of absolute of either we're part of it or we're not doesn't actually work very well in terms of confronting and dealing with that problem. It's more important to try to identify what actors are actually trying to make the problem worse versus who are trying to make it better, and to try to do the things that get us off of those systems, but understanding we may still be reliant a bit on those systems for the time being. And that situation is absurd, but not hopeless. And for those of us who can confront that absurdity, who have the capacity to, having a sort of absurdist outlook gives you the flexibility to be able to withstand the pessimism, but still hold on to the optimism. Again, you might look at an example like, for instance, people wearing frog uniforms to protests as an example of using humor and absurdity in order to break what was actually a serious tactic on the part of oligarchy to try and portray a message. Again, enjoy making trouble. I hope that's been an insightful episode for you. And if you have any questions, be sure to send us an email at info@sierraclub.ca. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions, events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Hydrogen Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter emailing list too. You can find a way to sign up for that at sierraclub.ca.